How do the absolute and the relative interact with Axiom II?
Most of us are familiar with both the notion of the absolute and the relative. And for the purposes of this exercise, we're starting from a relative basis. So, in other words, we're assuming that there isn't anything about the absolute that we're going to carry along as an assumption. We're just going to notice the notion of the relative and work within that context. So, for instance, if I were to try to measure something, I have to bring the tape measure with me. I can't assume that it has a size prior to actually having a measurement of it. So, in other words, if I had an empty universe and there was an object in it, just a single object with nothing else, I wouldn't be able to assess its size because it's not relative to anything else that has a size. So that sense of it doesn't have a size unless there's something to compare it to is actually quite important when thinking about Axiom 2, because we're effectively starting with the notion of an empty universe, and we're seeing what kinds of things happen when we try to imagine various states of affairs in that universe, and particularly, the relationship between existence and interaction. So, for instance, if we start from the default assumption that the notion of interaction is dependent upon or predicated upon the notion of existence, then we might want to basically just sort of show that, right? So, for instance, in our imagined scenario, we might say, okay, well, I'm going to have two objects, and the state of them not interacting is when they're somehow apart from one another, and the state of their interacting is when they're somehow touching one another. And I'm simplifying the entire universe, not just in the sense that it's mostly empty, but also in the sense that the notion of interaction is just the notion of touching or contact, right? So, for instance, anything that would be described as, say, a field or some sort of electromagnetic influence or anything else is one or another ways of conceiving of the notion of interaction. But if we're just going to say, okay, we're going to simplify all the forces to be one kind of force, or all kinds of contact to be one kind of contact, then in effect we're not only simplifying the thing in terms of what sort of objects are in the universe or how many they are, but also what kinds of interactions exist between them. So vastly simplified. So in effect, there's a space here where the first thing that we do is we imagine a universe with something in it, and then we, from the language of the things, we now have the notion of having a language of states, i.e., not touching or touching. So in effect, we've just constructed this super simple idea of just two states of contact. And in other words, there's a couple of technical things, like what happens if the two objects are in the same place at the same time. Well, that would be an overlapped object, and the notion of whether it's distinct or not comes up. Is it one object or is it two objects? Well, how would I tell? One of the background assumptions behind a lot of this, or just a general rule to keep in mind, is that which cannot be distinguished must be the same. So if I can't distinguish between two objects overlapped in space and time and just having one object, then to some extent I have to treat those two concepts as the same concept. So in this sense, the three states of separate, touching, and overlapped now are just two states of either they're separated or they're touching one another. Because of principle of identity, that which must be distinguished, that which cannot be distinguished must be the same. Therefore, we now have a simplified perspective, even in a sense of what existence and interaction themselves actually mean. So then it could be asked, well, okay, so we have these two states. What causes one state to be transitioned to the other state? So, for example, the state of non-interacting to the state of interacting, or the state of interacting to the state of non-interacting. Where does that concept of change live in the schema of the notion of existence and the notion of state, i.e., the notion of existence and the notion of interaction? Interaction is described as a kind of state of existence, right? So if I'm looking at characterizing these concepts as a kind of topology, then to the degree that the notion of interaction or the notion of state is contingent on the notion of existence, and I have two conceptual classes, right? The class of existing things, and then this dependent class of various states of existence, interacting or not interacting, touching or not touching in this case. So where would the notion of motion live in that schema? So the first thing to notice in asking that question is that it's neither purely an existential thing, nor is it a state. The notion of change is somehow in addition to the notion of existence and in addition to the notion of state. Change of state is not a state. It's something in addition to a state. And does the notion of change of state occur after the notion of state, or does it in sense occur before the notion of state? Well, this is where we sort of back up and we look at the the mere fact that the whole scenario itself is an imagined scenario. To some extent, we're actually looking at the properties of imagination itself, right? So what is involved in the relationship between myself as the imaginer and the thing that I'm imagining? And in effect, if I try to actually look at that, like I basically say, okay, if there's some sort of relativity that is described in the relationship between two objects moving from non-contact into contact. On one hand, I can describe myself as maybe as if I was one of the objects and I could see the other object coming to me, or I could, the very action of seeing is a kind of contact. So I either see it or I don't, for example. Maybe I don't see it until it essentially touches, right? Until that moment, I'm blind, and then I can feel it as soon as it hits my nose, right? So, so in effect, there's a notion here that the relationship between the two objects in this otherwise empty space and the notion of interaction or the notion of creation is roughly analogous to the notion of myself as an imaginer and the things that I'm imagining, this universe of concepts that we're sort of constructing here. And in either case, we notice that the notion of change is neither the is neither purely in the subject or the object in the sense of imagining something, nor purely in the objects themselves and the world is being imagined, but is actually something which is in addition to both the objects and the states, right? And in the sense of my imagining something, the state would be I'm either imagining it or I'm not, right? So, however I was before I started imagining something, and however I'll remain to be after I imagine a scenario, like, an hour from now, we won't be having this conversation about imagined objects. So, in a sense, there's a sort of parallelism between these two constructions: the experience firsthand of imagining something, and the scenario inside of the imagined world themselves, in terms of what is the minimum number of concepts necessary to even imagine the scenario at all. And then when we look at the minimum number of concepts, we're basically saying, well, there's three classes of concepts: that of existing things, that of states, and that of changes of states. But in order to do the imagination, we notice that the sequencing between those isn't arbitrary. I can't imagine the change prior to the actual notion of interaction. Like if the notion of interaction is the outcome of a change, or if the notion of state is the outcome of a change, and it cannot not be the outcome of a change, right? So this was part of the thing that the paper sort of goes through, is that in any attempt that I try to imagine a change of state, I notice that I have to have it happen after the notion of existence and before the notion of interaction, no matter how I go about it. In other words, the sequencing of this particular dynamic is built into the very nature of imagination itself. It's built into the nature of process itself. And that's the key insight. And you can try it all you want. I mean, you can sit in meditation and try to imagine non-changing changes. I mean, this is the sound of one hand clapping, for example, right? And so, in effect, you notice that in the dynamics of trying to have it any other way, to reduce the three concepts of existence, interaction, and change to just being two concept classes. Like, how would you imagine that? No matter how you go about it, no matter how simple you make it, you end up with essentially this sort of underlying observation that there are always actually three classes of concepts, but that the action of imagination as a process, or the action of interaction as a process, is actually secondly contingent on both existence and change. And so in that sense, if we say, okay, what are the modal classes that are being represented here? Well, if existence is omniscient and interaction is immanent, then whatever is change has to be between, as in both after existence in the sense of omniscience and before interaction in the sense of immanent. Has to be between. So in that sense, if the notion of betweenness is represented as a kind of transcendent, i.e., a sort of second person perspective, right? Because in effect, there's a second person relationship between the two objects, right? The two billiard balls in space, or the 2 points, or however you want to, set up that imagination. That the relationship between them is as peers, and in a real sense, the relationship between you and the things you imagine is also one of peers. You're experiencing it in the first person perspective. You can imagine yourself imagining something, or you can be aware of yourself as the creator of that which you imagine. And you can also acknowledge that there's a reality of you that goes beyond the imagined scenario, i.e., the part of you that's lying on the bed when you're dreaming. But the immediate first person experience is essentially the fundamental one, right? In the sense of, without that, we can't distinguish between imagining and not imagining something. So again, under principle of identity, there's a peerage relationship between yourself as the observer and the object as the observed. So in this sense, in both cases, we're seeing that the notion of the transcendent, the notion of the second person relationship as a kind of peerage relationship, is occurring after the omniscient and before the transcendent. So in the sequence of the relationship between these three axioms, the Axiom II dynamic goes that specific way. It goes from the omniscient through the transcendent to the immanent. And it does it every time. Because anytime that I try to do anything other than that, I discover that there's this other concept that is always between the omniscient and the immanent. If I go from the immanent to the omniscient, I can do that in one step. But if I try to go from the omniscient to the immanent, I have to do it in 2 steps. And that second step, that other step, is essentially the passing through the transcendent. So of the 2 ways that Axiom 2 can flow, it always ends up going in this specific direction. It's in a sense built into the very nature of process. In this particular case, the process of imagination. It's built into the very nature of process in the sense of built into the nature of interaction itself. That I can't think about process without, however, already presuppose the notion of change. So in that first person sense, which is again, the grounded first person sense is declared by Axiom I, if we're holding with Axiom I as the immanent is more fundamental than the omniscient and or the transcendent, and that we're therefore saying, okay, we're taking the notion of the immanent seriously as the ground. We're observing that the notion of the immanent in this specific sense is a second person concept. It's essentially a kind of peerage relationship. And so insofar as it's fundamentally a peerage relationship, it's not a concept or a theory that is described in some sort of omniscient way. That would be a kind of hierarchical relationship, some sort of dependency notion. But in this particular case, the notion of dependency isn't structural in a sense of one thing resting on top of something else in a kind of vertical way. It's a predecessor sort of relationship in the sense that something happened before something else, and that the time concept is more fundamental than the structure concept of the relationships of space. So that sense of things stacked on top of one another is a sort of spatial relationship. But the thing of something happening before something else is a temporal relationship. And since we're taking the notion of the immanent as basically being fundamental via Axiom I, then when I move on to Axiom 2 and I'm thinking about Axiom 2 dynamics, I'm basically saying that the notion of the first person, how I experience imagination, how anybody would experience imagination, or what is the second person relationship between the 2 objects in the space that I'm imagining. In both of these cases, I see that in the nature of process itself, I cannot not presuppose the notion of both existence and change in order for there to be the concept of process in any sense that is first person, and in any sense that involves the notion of newness or creativeness or anything like that at all. So that's the basic argument that essentially defines the orientedness of Axiom 2. So the first part of the essay just points out that there's between three entities or three things or three um, elements arranged in sequence in linear form or in circular form or whatever, that one way or another you really only have two possibilities. The arrows can go clockwise or they can go counterclockwise, and however you label them, it'll end up being the same thing, right? There'll be two possibilities. Now, at this particular point, having gone through the exercise of saying we're grounded in an axiom one sense of the immanent, therefore, in the first person experience of second person concepts or second person relationships, in order to create essentially an awareness of these concepts, noticing that um, in any process of imagination, that I have to have the notion of change. I have to have the notion of somehow something coming into being. That in that particular sense, the ordering therefore becomes clear, of going omniscient through transcendent back to immanent. And that therefore in the immanent, I'd say the transcendent was prior to the immanent, and somehow or another that the omniscient both comes after the immanent and also before the transcendent, which is entirely, am I putting existence, interaction, and change as a triple? In this case, yes. So the notion of change and the notion of creation are essentially taken as equivalent in this example. So in this particular situation, you'll notice that when I'm talking about the content of the imagined scene, I'm using the word change. When I'm talking about the action of imagining the situation, I'm talking about creation. Where did the things in the imagined world come from? Well, they came from me, the imaginer. I'm not part of the world. I'm outside of it. I'm basically looking at it. So in that sense, relative to the the world that I'm imagining, I'm the creator of that world. I'm like some sort of deity that's living outside in some sort of transcendent way. So in that sense, we would describe it as, where did the newness come from? The change from not having imagined something, i.e., I'm just sitting going about my day, to I close my eyes and I visualize this scene. Where did that scene come from? How did it come into being? So in that sense, it's a change, right? It's a change in my state of engaging with you versus close my eyes and this visual versus the notion of creation. The notion of change and the notion of creation essentially partake of one another in this specific sense, to the degree that I might not be able to tell whether or not I'm already an element of someone else's larger imagination. This goes back to the sort. There's another Cohen here. A philosopher one time dreamed that he was a butterfly, and then forever after wondered whether or not he was a butterfly dreaming that he was a philosopher, or a philosopher that dreamed of the butterfly. How would you ever know? Right? In a certain sense, what test could you possibly perform that would essentially distinguish between those two scenarios? In a sense, the principle of identity comes to apply. There is no way that you would be able to, in principle, authoritatively suggest which is the preferred way to think about it. Now, naturally, we would say, well, let's see, it's probably the case that butterflies are a lot less cognitively complex than philosophers. And the philosophers can therefore hold the notion of the cognition of a butterfly much more easily than a butterfly could hold the cognition of a philosopher. So we're going to hold the notion of the philosopher imagining a butterfly as the more basic one. But notice the relativity that we're taking in. We're assuming a notion of cognitive complexity as a prior basis for distinguishing which way we would prefer that. But there's no particular reason why we would be allowed or even have a reason to make that particular assumption. So in that particular sense, if cognitive complexity wasn't something we were assuming, there would be no basis as to which way the imaginative scenario would go. So in that particular sense, if we're sitting here now having this conversation, is there any real reason why we would be able to assert authoritatively that there wasn't some larger meta creature, for example, that was dreaming us into this event of being here right now, having this moment of experience? Is there any definitive test that we could do in this reality that would say for sure that that wasn't a possible scenario? Now, on one hand, we could say, well, this isn't necessarily saying there is such a thing, but it's also not saying there isn't such a thing. There's nothing that you could do that would definitively for sure establish one way or the other. But in the sense that we can actually ourselves imagine something and have the experience of creating the world that we imagine, then to some extent there's a suggestion that at least it might be possible that we ourselves could be in that same relationship relative to some other creature, some other being in some meta universe. Now, I want to be a little careful about this because, for one thing, I'm not trying to make an argument for deity. That's a long and tried practice and goes back a bunch of years, but that's not what I'm talking about today. The other thing I'm not trying to do is to try to convince anybody that we're living in some sort of simulation or dream. But I am saying that for the most part, that inherent in the dynamic of imagination itself are certain characteristic properties, that inherent in the nature of change and the nature of process itself are certain characteristic properties. And these aspects or properties of the notion of interaction and the notion of comparison and the notion of time and so on and so forth are the very substances that we are working with, or the very natures of what we're working with when we're thinking about metaphysics. So in that particular sense, if we say, okay, we started with this notion of foundational triplication, we created some analog of Axiom III, and then we basically said, okay, well, for various reasons, it makes a lot of sense to basically think that the relationship between things is more basic conceptually than the things themselves, i.e., that the relationship between true and false is more basic than the notion of true and false, or the relationship between content and context is more basic or somehow other than both content and context. Then we formalize that and we say, okay, Axiom 1 is going to be some version of relationship is more fundamental than identity, but because there's three of them, we're going to say there's one relationship and two identities, or maybe two relationships and one identity. But because relationship's more basic, we'll start with the notion of relationship as being more fundamental, and therefore we'll hold that as a sense of there being two identities, and this feels natural, and we go for it. But then we take that seriously. We say, okay, from now on, we're going to conceive of everything in the first person sense. We're going to see where that leads us. And the first person sense includes the process of imagination. And it includes details about the specifics of how imagination works, regardless of what we imagine. And so then we try to imagine something really simple, like really, really simple, basic existence by itself. Okay. So there's an empty universe with a thing in it. All right, that's great. Do we have a notion of interaction yet? Nope. We don't have an immediacy aside from my first person relationship to the thing that I'm imagining. I want to create the notion of interaction in that world. So now I'm going to imagine two objects, and I'm going to say somehow the relationship between them is more basic. Okay. So what is the change that I need to do in order for that to happen? Now all of a sudden we've got the notion of change and creation and process as essentially being tautologically connected. There's now an isomorphism between these three concepts. Because again, at this particular level, much in the same way as with the butterfly and the philosopher, we're not assuming anything additional, right? We're not taking for granted that there's some absolute basis upon which this sort of construction is going to be reified with respect to, that we don't notice that we're adding when we're doing it. So in effect, what happens is that we say, okay, on what basis can I distinguish between the notion of change, the notion of process, and the notion of creation? And it turns out that without making other assumptions, I can't distinguish between those three concepts. They are, in this particular sense, isomorphs of one another, or even better than that, they are identities. There's a sense in which it's the same concept. Because on what basis would I distinguish those three? Well, at this particular level, without making other assumptions, there's none. So putting all that aside for a moment and just basically saying, okay, what have we noticed in summation? Well, we've noticed that there are three concepts, and we've noticed that they have a distinct sequence to them in the first person. And at that point, everything after that is in addition. So where does that leave us? Well, pretty much with a statement of Axiom II. Once we have that, we can basically say things like, well, is it the case that the process of thinking about these kinds of things follows the same rules as the things themselves that we're thinking about? And if we're taking these notions seriously, if we're basically saying we're starting at the level of foundation, if foundational triplication is true, the answer to that should be yes. And when we actually try it, we find out that, in fact, it does actually work that way. That's a bit of an exercise, but let's just say that at this particular point, we're now starting to think about, are the rules, in this case, the axioms of 3, 1, and 2, able to characterize the notion of process? Are they able to characterize the notion of the process of definition, or the process of essentially describing themselves which would itself be a kind of active imagination. Any metaphysics that doesn't include a description of the process of imagination itself obviously is not going to be able to say anything specific about the process of imagination of the axioms. So in effect, if we're going to be complete about this at some point or another, we're basically saying that the notion of identities, relationships, and domains themselves as a kind of triple should both enclose and be enclosed by the axioms and the modalities. And this does in fact work. If you try it, it works. Right? If we take the notion of the axioms as being a kind of content that I can imagine, that describes the relationship between the concepts of domain, relationship, and identity, and I treat those concepts as themselves, both instantiated within the sense of the modalities, in the sense that all three of those concepts are in a one-to-one relationship with the modality, and that I then formulate the relationships between those concepts in terms of the axioms, and I say, does that describe the relationship between those concepts and the axioms themselves in the dynamic of my imagining them, in the dynamic of my defining them? And it turns out that, yes, in fact, that does actually happen. And this is the move essentially that finishes the job. It's essentially at this point, we've come full circle. We started with foundational triplication and type isomorphism, and we've arrived at the axioms, and the axioms become fully self-descriptive, which at this point means that not only are they self-descriptive, but they are self-descriptive of the process of being self-descriptive. And they do so in a sense of the closure of the notion of the relationships between domain, relationship, and identity. And that's QED. At that point, we've basically established both the necessity and the sufficiency of the system. And that's it. Everything else after that is essentially ways of understanding what we've arrived at today. And there's a lot there. I mean, the next piece talking about the errors of extrema, for example, are ways of sort of holding these concepts and taking the notion of Axiom I seriously in the process, or held within the process of Axiom II. But that would be the next sort of chunk of content.